jingle bells, we're reading all the way. Welcome back, campers, to our special North Pole themed edition of the Book Camp Podcast, where you can burn the marshmallows, but you cannot burn the books. Let's review real quick. Last time we discussed Fear in 3 interesting novels: Dorothy Must Die, Speak, and Slaughterhouse-Five. During our discussions, we focused on what makes a good discussion, which, if you'll recall, is listen to your peers, respond to their statements before you make your own, and make connections between your works. I think we had a particularly excellent discussion. What do you guys think?
I enjoyed it personally.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
I thought it was good. So this month we're going to be taking a new tactic. We're going to keep on doing those excellent discussion topics that we focused on, but we are going to introduce a new focus on questioning. So let's talk about why we ask questions when we discuss. As your toolbox says, questions are the key to understanding. They can clarify any confusion you have, they can stimulate research, they can initiate reflection, and they can stimulate curiosity. It's not possible to be a good thinker and simultaneously be a poor questioner. So if you're asking good questions, you're coming up with good answers, you know what you're talking about, is what we're thinking. So this month we've focused in particular on bringing good questions to the table. You'll hear us asking them, and hopefully these good questions will stimulate good discussion. So we have a very exciting topic that I know you'll be excited to hear about. Our sessions this book club are going to focus on feminist critique. We're going to take apart the novels that we've been reading and focus on how a feminist would view them. We're really excited about it. Before we get started, then, we wanted to go over some of the main points of feminist critique. Remember that feminists essentially believe that women are oppressed by the patriarchy and that it's our culture that determines that women should be oppressed. It's not biology that makes women, quote, the weaker sex. It's the fact that our society has decided that women are the weaker sex, and they're perpetuating that. So feminists seek to correct that perpetuation of ideas by pointing them out and identifying why they're not true. So we're going to really quickly introduce the books that we've chosen to discuss today. Miss Oz, would you like to begin?
Yeah, I actually read The Red Queen by Victoria Aveyard. It was a book that was recommended from our last book camp, so I went out and bought it and was addicted to it.
I know that a lot of my students are reading it. They're really enjoying it right now.
Oh my
It's
gosh.
on my to-read list for sure.
I was driving to work just wishing I could be reading this book. It was amazing. So it is a fantasy, and I don't know that it's young adult. Probably young adult novel. And there's 2 races of humans. So there's the red bloods and the silver bloods. And the red bloods are more peasant-like. The silver bloods are more the elite, upper-class royalty. And they all, each line have different powers. It's sort of like Game of Thrones meets Divergent a little bit in that aspect. Mm-hmm. So I won't give away too much of the plot. Let's just say that a red queen emerges through circumstances. So I'll leave you at that.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm looking forward to reading that. It's on my to-read list. Rit's here, and I'm reading Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, and just to be straight up with you, it is not a young adult fiction. I would only read it if you have what I would call a strong stomach and an open mind. It's equated to George Orwell's 1984, and that it's a dystopian novel set in the future, but we're not quite sure how far in the future this is, but it's a post-apocalyptic U.S. No longer exists. It's been overthrown by a theocracy, an extremist extremist Christian theocracy, and it follows a handmaid named Fred, and she's in the Republic of Gilead. And she lives in a time period where women have 0 rights. They're not even considered human. It kind of goes back to the age of slavery, in which women are property. And we definitely follow her through her trials and tribulations dealing with that, navigating that, and ultimately overthrowing that. Miss Franco, what did you bring for us today?
All right, this is Miss Franco, and I am actually rereading the Hunger Games series in honor of the latest movie coming out. Woohoo! And it focuses on Katniss Everdeen and her role in the Hunger Games. It is a largely dystopian society in which every year teenagers or young adults are drawn into kind of a reality show which focuses on survival of the fittest, and you know, the winner has to kill everyone, I guess, to survive.
Naturally.
Yeah. And I chose this one because I love it, and I know it's been a very popular novel for a while, but Katniss kind of pushes the envelope a lot in regards to kind of some feministic ideals, because she doesn't quite initially meet, you know, a feminist character, but kind of evolves into one.
And this is back to McCown. I guess my book is once again the outlier here. As always. You're going to find out it's really different. But I am reading the Charles Portis Western True Grit, which I read because I've watched both of the movies and I love them, both the John Wayne version from the 60s and the Coen Brothers version that came out in 2010. I love both of those movies. So I've been reading the novel, which was also written in 1968. And it's fantastic. It's the story of Maddie Ross, who's a 14-year-old girl who basically sets out into Indian country back in the 1800s to hunt down her father's killer and avenge his death. So she basically enlists the help of this crusty, rusty old marshal named Rooster Cogburn, played famously by John Wayne in the old version. And she and Rooster Cogburn hunt down through this Western territory this notorious murderer. So it's a great story. It's a Western to the bone. And I have a lot of great things to talk about it, so I'm not going to ruin it here. We are really excited to get going with the discussion. We wanted to point out that each of us have brought questions. We've been prepared. All four of us teachers have questions written out. And actually, while we were discussing the books earlier, Miss Oz and I actually wrote down more questions. Like we noted that we talked about time periods, and so we both took note of that to bring up later. The thing is, we have a limited amount of time, and we know you guys will too in your book club discussions. So we're going to just start with the questions we have and see where the conversation takes us. Ms. Ritz, would you be interested in asking your first question and seeing where it takes us?
I would love to. I made note of a few things, and one of the things is the use of names in my text. So in my text, the handmaids' names reflect their commander, so the person they work for. And in fact, they remain nameless. So their identity is kind of stripped when their name is stripped. So when they are, quote unquote, reconditioned or re-educated to be a handmaiden, their former identity and therefore their former name is taken away. So for example, my handmaiden's name, the narrator in my text, his name is of Fred, which means she's property of the commander named Fred. So something I want to throw out to the discussion here is, if names are a social decorum that conventionally assign gender to a child when they're born, what does your character's name say about their place in society in your text?
Okay, well, I'll start in my book, in Miss Oz, hi Miss Oz, Red Queen. I noticed some of the same things when my main character, her name is Mare Barrow to begin with, and then she is sort of escalated into the Silver Society, and they have to change her name. And so on one hand, I thought that symbolized more of the Marxist, like the upper class versus lower class, and that she had to have a new name to exist in that world. But it's interesting that they had to change her name to something I feel is more feminine. Mare is less feminine, and now she goes by Marina. And I thought that was interesting, especially since her betrothed, he can go by Cal, and it's not considered inappropriate. So even though he's of that higher social class, he still gets to keep his sort of shortened name. And I think if he had been female, he would have had to go by something else. I don't know, Calienda or something. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of bringing that back to my text in The Handmaid's Tale, this is Ritz again. Something I noticed as well is how the social class in my text also reflect the name change. So, for example, like I said, my text is taking place post-apocalyptic. So we're in a dystopia era here, and what happened was the men got to keep their name when the new society, the new regime came into power, but the women had to change it, not just the handmaids like I suggested. Even the women of upper class in this new society, they still had to change their names.
So do we see any equivalents to that in our society today? Are we still dealing with issues along those lines?
Well, I believe, for example, I got married in May, and I'm still changing my last name because you'd be surprised how much goes into a name. Every document, even ordering something from Amazon, it shows up to my door with my maiden name on it. I have to go through so many avenues to change my name because society says when I get married, my last name should be that of the males.
I think it's also too important to point out in that regard that we change our last names, and the line of our families can end with a female being born into a family, whereas some of us, Miss Franco, has all boys, and this masculine moniker that is going to continue on, and because I have all boys, and yet the importance of the female family name just kind of goes up in flames once it dies out.
Yep. All right, Miss Franco. So we've been talking about the use of names in the text, and something I want to point out is the name of your main character, Katniss. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, interestingly enough, Katniss is actually a flower that could be found in the meadows around District 12. And I did a little more research into some of the other names. Primrose, also a delicate flower. Effie Trinket. Trinket is, a throwaway object, a piece of cheap jewelry. All of these things are objects. And it just goes back to, the significance of the name. That these women, all of the female names, are not very strong. And they're objectified, although we see evolution. Katniss becomes the Mockingjay. She becomes the girl on fire and evolves into this very strong character, feminist character in the book, as do some of the others. Rue. If you look up the definition of Rue, but we see some evolution in that. But to start out, we definitely have these very objectified female names, whereas some of the men names, Caesar, Cinna, all very famous. Correlations to Julius Caesar and, these very strong male characters.
And I would have to say that Katniss is a lot like Maddie Ross in True Grit, in that she does grow throughout the text and kind of break free from that mold of the feminist objectification. McCown, you want to?
Yeah, very much so. Maddie Ross is definitely, even as the book begins, she's outside of her traditional role. The very first line in the book is, "People don't think it could be true that a 14-year-old girl could go hunting through Indian territory in the middle of winter, but I'm here to tell you that it is." And so she basically spends her entire plot of the book defending her right to be in charge to a bunch of adult men. She does business transactions. She goes multiple business transactions with men throughout the beginning of the novel, and she proves her worth over and over again in various violent and difficult situations as the story progresses.
She's got spunk.
She's got true grit, if you will.
Oh my goodness.
So she really is, and the people who know her admit that she is not a traditional girl. But if you want to talk about names, her name is still Maddie, which is a diminutive of Madeline, which is a very feminine name. Maddie is a little girl's name.
Right.
But she refuses to be pigeonholed by her name. In fact, the name is a little bit of an ironic thing because she is so much more mature and adult than her name implies.
Right.
I guess I have a question in regards to that. I mean, what do you guys think constitutes masculinity as opposed to femininity. We have these names. I know that there was a quote that I pulled out that talks about when Katniss is taken to the Capitol. One of the first things they do, she's this rugged girl that is out hunting with a bow and such. And the first thing when she gets to the Capitol, it's all about perception, appearance, of having this female look.
Right.
You know, and
They give her a makeover, actually,
right.
don't they?
So, you know, she goes from this objectified name, if you will, of Katniss, and then making her over into this feminine character. And then she's awesome. You know, she evolves into the Mockingjay, the girl on fire, and goes on to start the process of taking down her own government.
That's interesting, Miss Franco, because Mare also, when she goes into the Silver Society, undergoes a makeover, and they put on makeup to make her skin more fair. She has the bustles and the new dresses and all of those things, so she also does. But what I thought that came to me, because Katniss changes from Katniss to the Mockingjay. Could Katniss, because that was feminine,
right,
did she then have to change her female moniker to the Mockingjay in
be
order to
perceived differently, to be this heroic character?
Interesting. Can I ask a question? So you, Ms. Franco, you asked what constitutes masculine and feminine. So it's an interesting idea to look at what constitutes masculine and feminine in the book itself, like in the time period that your book is set in. But an even more interesting question, if you ask me, is what does the author think masculine and feminine means? Because your books were all written by women, contemporary women, and mostly the last 10 years, 5-10 years.
Mine was this year.
Yeah, this year. Whereas mine was written by a man. So it's interesting to look at our books and see what the author thinks constitutes masculine and feminine. So both of you have books, Miss Oz and Miss Franco have books written by women.
Right.
And both of you feature a makeover of sorts that turns you into a more attractive, more successful, more powerful woman. Do you think that your authors are making statements about you have to be beautiful to be successful, or do you think that's just something part of the wish fulfillment on the behalf of the author?
This is Miss Franco. Actually, I think she's my author for the Hunger Games is doing the opposite of that.
Okay.
I think it's satirical because she doesn't put it in a positive light when she receives this makeover. One of the quotes I wrote down was, let's see, I've been in the remake center for more than 3 hours. Vina and the others of my prep team have addressed some obvious problems. This has included scrubbing down my body with a gritty foam that has removed not only dirt, but at least 3 layers of skin, turning my nails into uniform shapes, and primarily ridding my body of hair. And I mean, uniform to me does not have a positive connotation usually, you know, where uniform, conformity. So I think my particular author is not saying that this was a necessary thing because ironically, she's about to jump into the Hunger Games
And
to
just
kill
be
people.
covered in mud and dirt and blood.
To kill people. And
Yeah.
yet, you know, this society, this capital society
It's
that...
all about surfaces.
Exactly.
And
This outer appearance.
what do you think, Miss Oz?
Well, a lot of my students, when we talked about the feminist critique and through that lens, they asked the question, is the traditional female role bad? Are we doing the opposite by placing structures that then shift just from females being perceived this way is the only good way to females being perceived the opposite of that is the only good way?
Right.
Or where it should be maybe through a more feminist thinking of there are no structures put in place where we get to choose which way. So they can choose to be these petite, fragile things, and there should be nothing wrong with that. I feel like my author is doing the same thing that Suzanne Collins was, in that she's satirically including these scenes. But my argument is that the fact that we have to say this is progressive is kind of defeating the initial feminist feeling of gender equality. When we have to say, oh, look how progressive my author is, and that my female is strong. The fact that we still have to address that is only feeding into this whole societal structures that are set in place.
She does satirize what the quote that I read, but at the same time, Primrose Everdeen is this young girl that's also, not just in this book, but in the later books in the series. She's a very strong girl. I mean, she's caring medically. She becomes almost a doctor and is caring for all of these wounded people while, the government overthrow is taking place. And she is this very delicate girl, seemingly in appearance and stature and her name. But at the same time, she is, portraying all of these other positive qualities that kind of coincide with that. So I'm not sure that they have to be one or the other. I think that Suzanne Collins is, satirizing the need for this perfect appearance, but at the same time saying that it's okay to be whatever you are, and that we shouldn't be judged based upon that.
And maybe even by looking at the portrayal of PETA might support that more than looking at the female characters.
Right.
Because PETA is very a non-traditional male character.
Empathetic. Yeah. Agreed.
Going off what you just said, Franco, of the idea of do they have to be one or the other, strong or extremely feminine and delicate, my text being that it was dystopic, it basically, the entire message is that choosing one or the other is going to implode and fail for a society. By making all the females choose you're a handmaiden or you're a cook didn't prove to be the perfect society that they intended it to be, and it ultimately fails, which ultimately reflects sometimes authors' fears of our actual society, going back to what Mr. McCown was suggesting about when our texts were written and who wrote them. My text was written by Margaret Atwood, who wrote it in the 1980s, which historically is a time where the women started to join the workforce, and women were getting into Wall Street, and they were picking up the suits and the briefcases and going into the workforce. So here she writes this text of, well, what if it was the complete opposite? Well, government, society, culture would fail.
All right, campers, we're back. So, this has been an interesting discussion. English teachers are people too, is kind of the theme of today. So we've been sitting here and talking about how we thought this discussion went. And to be honest with you, we saw some areas for improvement. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to have a quick metacognitive discussion where we talked out how we thought the discussion went, what we can learn from it, and how we're going to make your guys' discussions better based off of what we learned. One of the things we thought was the discussion didn't feel as natural as it did last time. What do you guys think led to that?
I think it was the session topic, to be quite honest. And not that it was a bad session topic. Each one of us did a good job of critiquing our text through the feminist lens, but it was connecting all of those critiques together. Like the conclusions from each critique were completely different.
Yeah.
And that the point is you all read different texts. How are you going to make connections?
Yeah, I think our topic last time of fear, we came to a more sort of connected conclusion when we ended the
It was
session.
kind of an essential statement.
Yeah.
Right. But also, I feel like that topic was not nearly as complicated as the topic that we had today.
Yeah.
We ourselves had to wrap our brains around what does feminist mean? How does it apply? And so, yes, it's going to be a little bit more complicated because the topic was more complicated. But I think we grew and we understood our text from a deeper level.
Yeah, no kidding.
So it was rewarding, but it was definitely more difficult.
Right. I mean, I know I looked at Hunger Games completely different after Franco, discussed the idea of Katniss, but connecting that to my book and yours, Miss Oz, and yours, Mr. McCown, that's where I feel, didn't do as great of a job as we could.
I completely agree. I loved that analysis of Hunger Games, and I've never thought about Katniss going on like that. But it has nothing to do with
Maddie
and True Grit at all. I was like, come on, I can't connect this to my book at all. And so then I had things I wanted to talk about, but the conversation never flowed that way. And honestly,
and you didn't force it though.
Yeah.
And that's
So some takeaway, it's going to be tougher.
Right.
It's going to be harder to talk about critical lenses because it's a more complex topic. 2, it's going to be harder to make connections between the texts. Notice we still did it.
right.
We did.
And that's number 3. We pushed on and we kept trying. And you'll hear if you go back and listen to it, you'll hear we actually connected to each other's works and we supported each other. And we tried, but there was a lot more thinking out loud and working things out and putting things together and coming up with it off the top of our heads, it felt like.
Right.
It did not flow as naturally as a more simple topic like fear would have. The moral of the story is we know this is going to be a tougher book club, but we know that your brains have grown since the last book club, and we know that we've been going through critical lenses. We know that you've been pushing yourselves and challenging yourselves with this. So we know that going into these book clubs with your peers from other classes, you're going to bring your A game, you're going to have a lot to talk about, and you're probably going to do an even better job than we did in this discussion because you are smart. So thank you for coming today. Be safe on your way home, driving through the snow, and
Watch out for reindeers.
oh jeez. All right. Have a great day, everybody.
I always get, when I get awkward, I blow my voice.